Hello everybody, welcome to my first ever challenge YouTube video. I'm feeling a little bit like a YouTuber in the year 2014 right now, and I would have loved to have had somebody collaborate with me, but unfortunately I don't have anyone to collaborate with me. But if you want to come back next year and be on my YouTube channel, you just let me know. So in today's challenge, I am going to answer the questions, my students' nightmare questions. I posted on Teams and I got a couple of responses on Teams, but I also got a couple of emails about what everybody's worst case scenario question is for the exam. Now, in saying this, I'm not trying to scare anyone, okay? Because some of these questions are pretty challenging. However, what I want to show you is that you can do it. And you could answer a question that is about something we have not spoken about in class at all, and you could do so really, really well. So this isn't set up to scare anyone, but rather to fill you with confidence. If it has the opposite effect on you, please let me know. So I have chosen 5 of these questions. If you are a little sad that your question didn't get chosen, or you would like to submit another one, I'm happy to make a part 2 because this is going to be really fun. But I've chosen 5 questions and I am going to put myself in exam conditions for the 15 minutes of planning for each of the questions. And I'm going to see what I can come up with. So 15 times 5. Whatever 15 times 5 is how long I'm going to record for. I'll speed it up, obviously. I don't want to make a 3-hour long video, and I'll show you what I can come up with. I also, like I said, I'm doing this in exam conditions, so I'm not going to check my notes. Let's see how I go. I'm actually a little nervous. You could try and do these with me if you are up for a challenge. Okay, so the first question that I am going to look at is analyze how Kent's choice of narrative perspective allows the reader to better understand the main characters. So of course, the first thing I'm going to do is to annotate my question, making sure that I understand exactly what it is that I am being asked to do. I think now's a good time for me to let you know that I am reusing some old A3 sheets of paper. That's why they look a little odd. So I've annotated it and I have looked at the main characters, so I've listed those. And now what I'm doing is I'm just having a look at which perspectives the novel uses. So I've listed first person, and I've got third person. I made the mistake when writing it as well, and listed the characters that are able to be looked at through third person. And you can see that I am looking at the fact that third person is quite unbiased, the fact that we get to see the growth of Margaret through the third person narration, and also that Nathan's paranoia is very well showcased with the third person perspective. I also really think it's important to look at Beyondel and how he is disempowered through third person perspective. Then we go to historical documents. So the fact that they provide context, they are accurate. And then I started listing different examples of them. So some poetry, the look at the minstrel books, and the letters as well. Then I've just gone through and color coded it, making sure that I am including characters as well as concepts, and also the aesthetic features and stylistic devices. So I'm going through and I am labeling each of the parts of my brainstorm as those different things because I know I want to include them in my essay. Now, there's no denying that I am actually never going to be a successful YouTuber because I only recorded about a quarter of this. So you'll just have to take my word for it that I did it under exam conditions. But I'm going to just run through my brainstorming at this point. So when I was looking at narrative perspective, I thought, okay, we've got 2 main narrative perspectives that the novel uses. Okay, so we've got first person and we've got third person. But I also wanted to include something about the historical documents because it is an interesting and unique way that Kent utilizes narration. So I have included that in my brainstorm. When I've looked at first person, I have identified the fact that the first person perspective voices an otherwise voiceless character. Because if I look at the cultural assumptions surrounding Agnes, there's no way that someone of her social status, of her gender, of her religion, of her class, of all of those sorts of things, the fact that she's unmarried, would have been given a voice within her society. So the first person narrative perspective voices an otherwise voiceless character. It allows us to see Agnes's attitudes, values, and beliefs. It is very emotive. And then I've also identified stream of consciousness because Kent utilizes stream of consciousness, particularly when we see Agnes heading towards her execution, and it gives us a wonderful insight into her mental state. Then, when I've looked at third person, I've identified the fact that it's omniscient because it's important that we see that Kent allows us to know about all of the characters. So, Toti, I think we see the impact of Agnes through the interactions that he has with, that says T and B. I'm not sure what I meant there. Make sure your planning is clear. Oh, wait, no, I meant like, no, I have, oh, Toadie's dad is what that meant. Oh my goodness, make sure your planning is clear so you know what you mean. I really only let myself go for 15 minutes. So yeah, unbiased. So it's a balanced perspective because it isn't from anyone's perspective. With Margaret, we see her growth. So we see her referring to Agnes as that bleep to my girl. So that's an example of dialogue, characterization, also juxtaposition. Natan's paranoia is really effectively represented through third person. For example, the death waves. This is a really strong piece of symbolism. And then, of course, we see Bjondel as being disempowered. So he would have been someone of the utmost power in his society. And through the narrative perspective chosen, he loses that power. And we don't really get to hear from him specifically. Thus, we get a more balanced version of who he is. With historical documents, it adds a sense of accuracy. It provides some context for us to understand these characters. The Minstrel book, for example, shows us that Agnes was identified as having an excellent intellect. The poetry that's included, both Agnes's and Rose's, I think helps us to understand Natan. And then Bjondel's letters really show us that authoritative side. Not side, that's all he is, but the true level in which he is that authoritative. Okay, so once I finished my brainstorm, I, as always, looked for commonalities between my points and I built my thesis statement based on that. So I went with the thesis statement that says, through Kent's approach to narration, readers are able to gain a balanced and thorough insight into the characters of the text, thus allowing them to better understand the messages of the text. Now, in hindsight, I think I would have made it say, thus allowing readers to better understand the messages of the text, because otherwise it might lose a bit of that cohesion. But of course, just because you decide on a thesis statement doesn't mean that you can't build on it as you continue planning. Then I've chosen to plan out each of my paragraphs knowing that I want to utilize the petal model because I want to make sure that I keep all of the correct components there. Now, when I am planning and I've just done a brainstorm, I don't like to repeat the things that are on my brainstorm, but rather mention them because, for example, if I've written out a quote on my brainstorm, I'm not going to write it in the plan again because I know that it's there, and that's often where I'll use color coding and things like that. So I hope that makes sense. Please let me know if it doesn't. So I've decided to then split the paragraphs up based on the brainstorms. Okay, so I've got my first person paragraph. I've chosen to stick with the giving a voice to someone otherwise voiceless. And I'm going to expand on that by looking at the times and the places and the fact that these left Agnes without agency. She had no control, no power, thus having no voice. The technique that I've chosen to look at is the stream of consciousness and the emotive language that is included in that. I'm thinking of the I am beyond time quote, but also I don't think that I would use too many direct quotes here when I'm looking at the stream of consciousness because a lot of the time it's embedded in big chunks, sort of thing, right? So what I would say is that, as Agnes heads towards her execution, as she no longer is making any sense, questioning things like ravens being swimming and the fact that she's drowning, these show us that she is unable to understand what's going on. In terms of the emotive language, I would look at things like when she says there are times where I wonder whether I'm not already dead, that kind of stuff, because it really shows her attitude and how she is being impacted. These techniques represent Agnes's attitudes, values, and beliefs. Therefore, the reader understands Agnes because they feel like they know her. It gets a really close insight into her. Now, the question asks me about main characters, not main character. So I need to make sure that I talk about more than just Agnes. And that's where the rest of my essay is going to come in. So I'm planning on my second body paragraph to be in third person. Sorry, not to be in third person. My whole essay will be in third person. But my second body paragraph is going to be about the use of the third person omniscient narration, the fact that it is balanced and unbiased. To expand on this, I'm going to look at the fact that there's less impact from the cultural assumptions of the time, thus making it less prejudiced in the narration approach. In terms of the techniques I want to use, I want to look at symbolism, I want to look at dialogue, and I want to look at characterization. Now, as I said before, I don't typically repeat things that are already on my plan. So you can see on my plan that I want to include the dialogue and characterization from Margaret, and the symbolism of the paranoia for Nathan being paranoid in what is happening, but also some dialogue for Toadie as well, because I'm really looking at focusing in on those three characters. And then if I'm going to analyze that, I'm going to say something like, readers see sides to characters that those in power wouldn't have allowed. So Bjondel wouldn't have allowed Margaret's viewpoint to get out there, thus we wouldn't be able to understand her opinion on growing to like Agnes, and stuff like that. Thirdly, the historical documents. I'm going to talk about how they provide context and accuracy, and I want to talk about the the excerpt from the Minstrel book, describing Agnes as having excellent intellect, and the poetry and the letters. For poetry, I want to focus on how Rose's poem helps us to understand Nathan better, and his impact on her, and then the letters from Bjondel having that authoritative tone, showing just how powerful he was in the time. If I'm analysing this, I'm going to look at the fact that multiple perspectives are availed, so therefore a deeper understanding is provided, and the context allows readers to truly understand by giving them more to go off. So that's my plan for the first question. Hopefully that makes it less of a nightmare for those of you that identified it as a nightmare. And if not, make sure you tell me. The second essay that I'm going to be planning for today is, what comment does Kent make through her construction of Seeger and Friedrich's relationship? So of course I'm going to be annotating the question, making sure I understand all of the components of it. So I'm going to be looking at the comment that Kent makes, that's the verb for the author. My cognitive verb is going to be analysed, and then the subject of my essay is going to be Seeger and Friedrich. So as you can see for this planning, I decided to, after I understood all of the parts of the question, I just wanted to brainstorm what it is that I knew about Seeger and Friedrich's relationship. So I've listed all of the different things that I could recall. So I have been able to identify the fact that, and obviously you can see from this plan that I have shortened all the characters' names, because this is just my planning, right? So I can use shorthand and all of that kind of stuff. So I've looked at Friedrich and the fact that he is described in the text as a daring sort of boy desperate to prove himself as a man. That's a good example of characterization. Seeger, however, is described as unschooled in nightmares and ghosts, which is a metaphor that makes me think that she is quite naive, and also too young and sweet to die, which is a quote that we talk about all the time in the text that's really important. Seeger is also given the housekeeper role by Nathan to embarrass Agnes. Friedrich wants to marry Seeger, and Nathan won't allow it. However, Friedrich offers Nathan money to do so. Now, this obviously represents the patriarchal ideals of the time, but it's quite ironic because we know that Friedrich values money quite a lot. And of course, Friedrich attempts murder after finding out what Nathan did to Seeger, which is a big part of their relationship. Now, after looking at all of that and looking at my notes at the top, I can see one major commonality between it all, and that it is representative of the patriarchy, of the patriarchal ideals of the time. So originally I came up with a thesis statement that says, through the representation of Friedrich and Seeger's relationship, Kent illustrates the fatal impacts of the patriarchal ideals in 19th century Iceland. And as I started writing my points, I realized that I didn't want to be limited to just the fatal impacts. So I've changed it to the dangerous impacts. One of those is that of a fatal nature, of course, but there are other dangerous elements to it. And I really believe that Seeger and Friedrich exist to showcase this. So the first point that I wanted to look at was the ownership of women. So Natan owned Siga. By having her as his house mistress, he had complete control over what she did with her life. Friedrich tried to buy Siga off of Natan. So this represents that patriarchal ideology that exists. Now, I'm going to look at the irony and the symbolism that I mentioned earlier. So it's quite an ironic element of the text that this happens, but also it is quite a symbolic one nonetheless. Now, if I'm analysing this, I would look at the fact that reducing women to property leads to a lack of worth. So that's obviously quite a dangerous thing to happen. Now, my second paragraph that I'm looking at is the power imbalance of their relationship. So Siga is described as being naive. So this is where I'm going to bring in the unschooled in nightmares and ghosts. And you might be wondering why I'm mentioning nightmares and ghosts, because obviously this isn't really a superstitious element to the text. Now I'm going to interpret and analyze this quote as nightmares and ghosts being that of the atrocities that occur, right? She was unschooled in nightmares that could happen, and obviously what happens to Siga, whilst we often look at her as getting an appeal and being a little more fortunate than Agnes, she still goes through a complete nightmare, and she's unschooled in that. She doesn't know about this yet. And she's too young and sweet to die. It's Bjondel that even describes her as this. So obviously she is an extremely naive, innocent young person, which then renders her as not really having a chance in this toxic environment. Siga is taken advantage of, and by that I mean by Friedrich, in the sense that I almost, and I think that I would include the fact that a lot of what Friedrich does seems to be to take a stand against Natan, to assert himself as this, like this alpha male almost in their time. And perhaps he was using Siga to do this. And he was, just trying to act out against Natan rather than really genuinely caring about Siga. And she's not able to advocate for herself because she is so naive. She probably doesn't even realize it. And then finally, I'm looking at the pressures of masculinity within the text. And I want to look at how this has become toxic for the characters. So obviously, we see Friedrich's actions. And by that, I don't just mean him killing Natan or being a part of the murder. I also mean, he killed the sheep. He also was quite violent on many occasions, and I'm going to interpret this as being fueled by his desperation to be a man. So that's when I will include that quote from before, the daring sort of boy desperate to prove himself as a man. And I want to analyze this in that multiple women pay the price for this. So obviously, if we look at burial rites, Agnes's outcome is that of a devastating nature, right? But Siga too pays the price for the men of the time doing these atrocities. So this pressure that Friedrich is clearly feeling is obviously something that contributes to the price that the women have to pay. So that's how I would tackle this question. Again, I hope it makes you feel a little more confident with it. If not, please let me know. Okay, the third and final topic that I'm going to be looking at for this video is burial rites depicts a society in which one's name holds significant impact on their identity. To what extent do you agree with this statement? I encourage you to pause this video and give this question a go before you look at my answers. But this is how not answers, rather, my interpretations. So, of course, I have unpacked the question, I have made sure I understand all of it, and I've decided to brainstorm by looking at the idea of a name and what I can think of in the novel that looks at a name. So, the first thing that I thought of was, of course, Agnes. And there are quite a few occasions in the text where Agnes's name comes into conversation or is at least alluded to. So, the first thing I thought of was when Toady and Bjondel are having a conversation about Agnes, and Toady refers to Agnes as Agnes, and Bjondel says you call her by her Christian name. The second thing I thought of was when Agnes referred to herself as Agnes Jonsdotter. And then I also thought about all the other things that Agnes gets called that isn't Agnes. So, for example, a murderess and some other things I'm not going to say in this video. Finally, one of my favourite parts in the text is when Agnes says, you, Agnes daughter, and she lists quite a couple of different things about her sentencing, but I've omitted that because I don't know if that's important. And to be honest, I don't think I would be able to memorize the whole quote. And I've said, you, Agnes daughter, I'll put an ellipses there, you, Agnes, Agnes, they don't know me, because I think that's quite interesting. I've also looked at Margaret. And Margaret, at the beginning of the text, states that she doesn't feel it's appropriate to call Agnes her Christian name. I've looked at the patronymic naming system and the fact that this represents belonging, gender, and power. And I've also looked at Lauger calling Agnes by her name at the very end of the text. This is an example of dialogue, but also an example of belonging. And you can see that I've gone through with my color coding again just to make sure that I can find the connections between my ideas, but also that I'm including all of the stuff that I want to. The final thing that I was able to come up with in my brainstorming is Natan being named after Satan. And I've identified there that that is reflective of religion, as is quite a couple of the things that I have found here. And I was going through, finding my connection, and I changed my thesis statement a few times whilst I was writing. And you can see that by how messy it is, because I'm looking at to what extent I agree with the fact that a name is impactful to one's identity. And originally I was like, well, yeah, it is 100%, especially with like the patronymic naming system and, you know, all of this talk about having a Christian name and all of that kind of stuff. But then that quote from Agnes about how she's talking about how they know her name, but they don't know her. And that reminded me of the rumors and the gossip and everything else of the time. So I decided to look at my thesis statement being burial rites depicts a society where one's name is significant to their identity. However, this is not always accurate. So that way I can talk about the three things that I wanted to. So my first body paragraph, I wanted to talk about how names are a way of asserting the religious and gender ideals of the time. Now, obviously, I don't think that this is a good thing, and this is quite a negative thing for characters such as Agnes, but it is a part of her identity in her society. So that's how I've expanded on that. It's a big part of identity in 19th century Iceland. I'm going to look at dialogue and I'm going to look at characterization. Again, like I said earlier, I'm not going to repeat the quotes because they're up in my brainstorm. And, you know, I don't want to use my time writing the same thing over and over again. But I'm going to look at all the talk about a Christian name because I think that that's really important. But also the patronymic naming system that exists. And I'm going to bring in that time when Agnes referred to herself as Agnes Jonsdottir because I think that that is really important here. When I'm analysing this, I'm looking at the patronymic naming system and ability to admit one's Christian name represents identity at the time. So the fact that people didn't want to call her by her Christian name because she was a murderess, I think is really important. My second body paragraph is that names represent belonging in burial rites. So using one's name shows how their identity matters. And I'm looking at that through lexical choice and dialogue. So the fact that Agnes is called things like a murderess instead of her Christian name furthers the notion that she doesn't belong. However, Lauger finally calling Agnes Agnes shows that she does belong to some extent. And I've mentioned the Jonsdottir quote there as well, because I think that it's important. I won't use the same piece of evidence twice, but I might allude back to it and say the time when Agnes referred to herself as Agnes Jonsdottir furthers the belonging, or something like that. As you can see, I did run out of room to continue on this piece of paper, so I have written on another piece of paper. But my third body paragraph is all about that knowing someone's name doesn't necessarily mean you know them. So my point of this paragraph is exactly as I just said. You know their name, you know their name, and this means that you know the character's reputation. So rumours run rampant in this place, and I think that that is a very important thing to discuss here. So I'm going to look at narrative viewpoint, and I'm going to look at the fact that Agnes asserts that just because people know her name people know her name. I don't know, this doesn't make sense, but as long as it makes sense to me, because it's just my planning. My essay, on the other hand, has to make total sense. So Agnes asserts that people know her name, but they don't know who she truly is. So it's not her true identity, but rather just her reputation. Here I would bring in the Satan Natan part as well. Obviously, Natan's not a good guy, but just the fact that names bring reputation. And I would also allude to the rumours that exist within the town. Okay, that's something that I would want to unpack a little bit further here. So all in all, my 3 points link back to the fact that names are definitely significant, but that doesn't always mean accuracy. And that is how I would answer this question. So as I said, if you have seen me answer your nightmare question and you feel like you are still in a nightmare, please let me know. I would love to bounce around some ideas with you all via email. And I'm going to go edit part 2 of this video now, so stay tuned.